Hi there, this is Catherine with Enfolded Heart Music. Welcome back to Lyre Foundations. Today we're continuing part 2, which primarily focuses on music theory. And today we're going to be looking at Chapter 4, Lesson 2. This focuses on scales and key signatures. I'll give a little bit of an overview of what we'll be covering, and then we'll jump into the specific content. So let's go ahead and take a look. Okay, so let's begin with just a general summary overview of what we're going to be talking about in this lesson. There really is quite a lot of content. It is a rather dense lesson just because of the nature of the way that keys work. And so, as I mentioned before, you may find it helpful to take a look at other videos on YouTube. I know there are many great musicians, many great teachers who cover the same information because it really is basic information for understanding music and music theory. And so sometimes just receiving information from a different perspective or, everybody explains things slightly differently. So there might be a helpful step for you in that. If you're really struggling with a particular part of this lesson, that would be one way to do it. It's mostly because this medium is limited because I can't receive your questions and respond to you in real time, which of course is what I would do if you were sitting in front of me as a student in sort of a private lesson. So that's one suggestion, especially with this particular lesson, because it's so fundamental and it sometimes is a little bit difficult to understand. Okay, so what is it, broadly speaking, that we're going to be talking about? The best way that I can explain it is that in lesson 1, the one we did just previous to this one, we learned about where the different notes are on the staff, right? Where the different pitches are on the staff, both treble clef, and bass clef. Okay, now those notes are organized in particular keys. These keys are comprised of different scales, and that will serve us as we move forward. There are major scales, minor scales, and those are the only two that we're going to be talking about for this particular time. And how we work within those scales and understanding how those scales are comprised is very helpful for us when reading sheet music, learning a particular song, and also especially with improvisation and composition. All right. And so there are several different parts. We're going to start with basics of whole steps and half steps because this is the building blocks of any scale. Then we're going to talk about how each scale, any major scale and any what's called a natural minor scale, how those are built out of whole steps and half steps. And we'll go through different examples of that. Following that, we're going to talk about kind of how this is written in regards to key signatures. This will tell us what key we're in, how to kind of memorize those as well. And then finally, we will end, this might be our second to last thing, what's called a circle of fifths. This is the relationship between all the different keys. There's actually a really nice and really helpful pattern so that we can organize all the information into one simple image, and that allows things to simplify and to not feel so overwhelmed by all this different information that we're trying to draw together into one comprehensive piece, which again always simplifies things. Then the final thing is actually what we're going to talk about is the difference between a diatonic and a chromatic instrument. This will make more sense after we've talked about what a key is. So those are the different parts that we're going to be going through. This might be a little bit longer video. I don't know. We'll see. But again, this is focusing on scales, which are kind of the basis of different keys, and then also key signatures, which signify what key we are in. Okay, so let's jump into the first part. Again, we're going to be looking at intervals, whole steps, and half steps. All right, so let's look at that. Okay, so before we can even talk about keys and how they are formed, the scales in which those are comprised of, we have to understand the difference fundamentally between a whole step and a half step. If you are watching this and you have not read page 49, I would do that now. I'm not going to go through that vocabulary. I'm actually going to assume that you know what those words already mean because it really is just definitions here. What I'd like to illustrate is on this, what I'd like to speak to is the illustration on page 49. This is obviously a piano, but it's very helpful to visualize and see some of these different ideas. Okay. So a half step is simply the smallest interval between two notes in any scale. Okay. On the piano, it is the very next note, either going up or going down to a particular key. This might mean that you have a white key and then a white key, and the half step without a black key in between. That would be a half step, as is illustrated below. Or you might go from a black key to a white key. Okay, so these tones, the pitch, you could say, is as close as possible in the way the instruments are made. It's as close as possible, this distance between two notes in a half step. Okay? A whole step is simply two half steps together. It's basically twice as big as a whole step. So to find a whole step, you would start on whatever note and go up or down two half steps. So basically two notes over. And this again on the piano is as close as possible as you can, the key that is as close as possible to it. Now I start with a piano because a piano is a chromatic instrument. Now, as I said before, I'm going to loop back around to diatonic versus chromatic, but I'm going to say it here first, and it'll maybe make more sense as I go forward. A chromatic instrument has all of the possible pitches on it. The piano is by far the easiest to understand this on. The lyre, this particular kind of lyre, they do make chromatic lyres, but that's not what we are focusing on in this course at large. But a diatonic lyre does not have every key. It is not the same as a piano. It rather is tuned to a particular key, which means that you set the strings according to the particular scale of that key. And so I'm not going to have C, C sharp, D, D sharp, E, F, F sharp, etc. I will only have my strings tuned to a particular key. So the idea of whole steps and half steps is not, we don't see that visually on the lyre because we don't have every single key on here. So that's why I used a piano for this image and to explain this concept. Okay, let's now hold this. If it doesn't make sense, it will make more sense in a second. The reason why this is important is because whole steps and half steps are the ways in which we form a scale. So I'm actually going to combine these two things, these two parts. So half step is right next to it. Whole step is two half steps, together. Okay. To form a scale, let's start with a major scale. A major scale, any scale really, is just a prescribed series of intervals between 8 notes. It's always going to be 8 notes. And you will always start and end on the same note, just one octave apart. So for example, if I have a C scale, I'm going to start on one C and I will end on another C. I could also do 2 octaves where I go from this C to this C and then do this scale one more time and go up here. But I will never begin a scale, for example, on C and end it on the E up here. The scale will always comprise of 8 notes. Now, how do we know what 8 notes those are? That's what this image on page 50 is telling us. Okay? And so this is a pattern that is true for every major scale, no matter which note you're starting on, which is why it's really helpful and really kind of cool. So we're going to use the examples that are listed here, C and then E. So C. How do we know what are the notes in a C major scale? Well, we follow the interval pattern that's listed above this. We start on a C, and then we would go up on a piano. We go up one whole step, then a second whole step. And with each of these, once I go up one whole step, that's the second note. So from C to D is a whole step because I go from C to C sharp, that's a half step, and then C sharp to D is a second half step. So putting those together is one whole step. So C is my first note, D is my second note. I then see that in my interval pattern, I have to go up one more whole, not whole note, whole step. There it is, whole step. I didn't even see it. A whole step, pardon me. From D, this will bring me then to E, because again, I go from D to D sharp and D sharp to E. From E, then I again go back to my interval pattern, and I see, oh, it has an H. So H stands for half step. So now I go up a half step, and because there's no black note on the piano between the E and F, going from E to F, rather than F sharp, for example, is actually a half step. So we go from E to F. After F, we see we need to go up another whole step, which will bring us to G. At G, we see we need to continue and go another whole step. This will bring us to A. Then from A, we go up a third whole step, and that brings us to B. And then finally, we go up a half step, because we see at the very end, we have an H here, so we go up a half a step. And from B, a half step up is simply C, because again, there's no black note between the B and C. So the pattern, again, for any major scale, the interval pattern, right? How big is the distance between one note to the next is whole step, half step, then whole step, whole step, whole step, and end with a half step. So this is why the second example is helpful, because with C major scale, we have no sharps or flats in this. It just, if we follow the pattern, that's just the way that it falls. And it has a particular sound to it. Right now, my lyre is tuned in C major. I have no sharps or no flats. And so this sounds like a typical scale. Okay, and going down. You could probably recognize that. Major scales have a kind of brightness to them. And they sound kind of happy, usually. Some a little bit more than others, but they always kind of have a happy, very positive sound to them. Okay, so let's take our second example of this. What happens when we start on an E? And again, we use the same interval pattern. How does this lead us forward? What notes do we end up with here? It may be helpful, I should say this too, to have either a picture of a keyboard. You could use the one on page 49, or if you happen to have a piano or a keyboard at your home, that would be nice also to follow with this, to really determine, to follow this interval pattern and to determine what note is actually going to be next. So we start on E, then we go up a whole step, and this brings us to F sharp, because again, if we take two half steps, the first half step takes us from E to F. That's one. The second half step takes us from F to F sharp. So we put those together and we'll go from E to F sharp. So now we're on an F sharp and we need to go up another whole step. Well, a half step would take us from F sharp to G, but then we need to go up another half step to create that whole step. We go from G to G sharp. Okay, so we have in our scale E, F sharp, G sharp. We now need to go up a half a step. This will bring us to A. From A, we go up a whole step, which is B. B, we need to go up another whole step. This will take us to C sharp. Again, this is because there's no black note between B and C. So we're at C sharp, we go up one more whole step, and that will take us to D sharp. And then we end with a half step going back to E. Now, if you're trying to do this as practice, which follows at the end of this lesson, and you don't end up on the same note that you started with, again, one octave up, then you've done something wrong. You've missed one of the intervals there. So that's a really helpful way to kind of check that. Okay? I'm sorry, my stomach is going crazy right now. I don't know if you can hear that. I kind of hope not. So that's major scales. You could do this starting on any note. You follow that prescription there, that interval pattern, and you will get your major scale. Again, another way to try this would to be if you have a keyboard or a piano, you could just pick a random note. It can be a black note, it can be a white note, it doesn't matter. Any note on the piano. use the interval pattern and then play those notes together and see if it sounds like a major scale, if you're familiar with kind of how that would sound. Okay, let's shift now to minor scales. Now there are different types of minor scales, but for the purposes of this book and this course, we're just going to focus on what's called a natural minor scale. So when I say minor scale, I mean natural minor scale. If you don't know what that means, that's totally fine. But if you do, I want to make sure that's very clear. There's harmonic minor scales, all that kind of stuff, but we're going to do the natural minor scale. Okay. Now, we're going to do this in the same way that we did the major scales, but notice that our interval pattern is different than the major scale. If it was the same, then we would just end up with another major scale. But it's different. Still comprised of whole steps and half steps, which is why that first part was so important to understand the very basic interval of a whole step and a half step. All right? So with a minor scale, whatever note you start on, you'll first go up one whole step, then you'll go up a half a step, which you can see that's different than the major scale. Then we go up two whole steps, so whole, whole. Then we go half step up, and then we end with two whole steps, whole step, whole step. So it's whole, half, whole, whole, half, whole, whole. So what does this look like in practice? We're going to start on the same notes that we started with a moment ago, C and E. But now we're going to use the pattern for the minor scale and see how different it is in regards to what note does it actually give us and what series of notes does it give us to create this particular scale. All right, so C, from C to D is a whole step, and that's what we want. So we go C to D, which is going to be the same, right? Because the first step in a major scale is also to go up a whole step. All right, but then we immediately have a half step. And so rather than going from D to E, like we did in our major scale, we will go from D to E flat. Now I will tell you in a moment how we know if it's a sharp or a flat. Okay. So we go to E flat. Then we need to go up another whole step, which will take us to F, another whole step from there, G, a half step from G takes us to A flat, then a whole step will take us to B flat, and then finally our last whole step takes us to C. So we have C, D, E flat, F, G, A flat, B flat, and C. Now when you have sharps or flats in your scale, you can see that I still have all the letters of the alphabet in that scale. So for example, if I, instead of using E flat, wrote that as D sharp, I would have C, D, D sharp, nothing on E, F, G, A flat, B flat, C. And we don't want that. That will end up, especially when you're tuning your lyre, that will end up with you being really off as you continue forward. So even though D sharp and E flat are the same note, you want to have all the letters of the alphabet as you go. So in the same way, let me give you another example with B flat at the end of this minor scale. We do not want that to say A sharp, because then we would have A flat and A sharp and then C, and we need to have B in there. Okay? All right, then our next example, we'll do this a little bit more quickly. We start on E again, and we follow our minor scale pattern, interval pattern. And we have E going up a whole step to F sharp, then a half step to G, a whole step to A whole step to B, a half step to C, a whole step to D, and then finally a whole step to E. Okay? So this is how we determine how to actually build a major or minor scale. All right? I'm going to talk at the end about the relationship between major and minor scales, because this is one of the most helpful things for improvisation and composition on a diatonic instrument. It opens up multiple scales or multiple keys for us to play within. Okay, so I'm going to pause that there. Make sure that you understand this very thoroughly before you move on, and try it. Really practicing with something is the best way to learn it. So that would be my encouragement to you. Pick a key and follow these patterns for both the major and minor interval pattern and give it a shot. And then you can either double check it online or even just visually check it if you start and end on the same note, and if you follow an alphabetical order from the beginning to the end, then you're probably going to be good to go. Okay, so let's pause there, give you a moment to process that, and then we'll come back to talk about key signatures. Okay, we're going to move now to looking at pages 50 and 51. So we started with intervals, whole step and half step. We understood how that built into scales. And now we're going to understand how a scale is the basis of keys and key signatures. Okay? Again, go ahead and read those paragraphs on page 50 if you haven't already done that. But essentially, what we need to know is that a key is simply the group of pitches within a particular scale. So once I have a scale, and especially in a diatonic instrument, once I've set my lyre according to that scale, that makes my instrument in a certain key. That means I'm going to be playing within those particular pitches. So for example, if I want to set my lyre into, let's do E major, that means I'm going to make all of my Fs and all of my Gs, all my Cs and all my Ds sharp. I will adjust my strings so that all of those notes I just named, F, G, C, and D, are sharp. And for the diatonic instrument, those are the only notes that I can play, the notes that are within that E major scale, because I don't have all notes available to me, unlike in a chromatic instrument. And so once I've set that, that is kind of the premise within which I can play at that point. And that means I've also set the key. So once you have a certain scale, you've already set the key. They kind of go into each other in that way. Okay, the key signature is simply kind of the symbolic way of pointing to the musician to say this is the particular key that you need to be playing in. If you're on a chromatic instrument, unless you have what's called accidentals, which are basically exceptions, you're not going to be using all the keys or all the strings on your instrument. You're only going to be using the pitches that are within that particular scale. And the key signature tells you which scale you're going to be playing within. All right? And so where do we find this? This is what I want to show you on the bottom of page 50. We have two different examples, one with sharps, one with flats. But essentially where you will find this is at the beginning, the far left-hand side of your music. It's often, I'd say by far most often and properly so, on every line of your sheet music. It should pop up there. And what this tells us, for example, in the first one where we have D major, which is also B minor, I'll talk about that a little bit later, is it shows a little sharp over F and over C. And this tells us that every F in that music is going to be F sharp. There will be no F naturals. Same thing with C. You will play all C's as C sharp. Now what that means for a diatonic instrument is simply that I want to make all my F's and all my C's sharp, which is what I talked about a moment ago. But that key signature tells me that that's what I want to do. Okay? Underneath that, the same premise works with flats. So here we only have one flat, it's B flat. And B flat means that I'll take all my B strings and make them flat. Now this is part of the reason it's important when you're understanding this scale to have all the letters of the alphabet. Because for example, in this second example, if I wanted to have B flats, and I say, well, actually, it's kind of the same as F sharp, not F sharp, goodness, A sharp. Yes, okay, I just confused myself there. A sharp. Well, that would mean that I take all my A strings and I make them A sharp. But then what I'm left with is two things. One, I'm left with B naturals, which does not belong. It's going to sound very weird, and it's going to sound like it doesn't fit, okay, when you're playing. And I'm also left without my A natural, which is included in that scale, is included in that key. And so I need to not mess with my A's. I need to pay attention to the fact that actually the B is what needs to be flat. and I don't need access, actually I really don't want access to a B natural. Okay? Now, usually what you're going to do to figure out how to set your lyre is not going to, you're not going to necessarily need to know this scale, okay, to figure it out from scratch. But it's really helpful to know how the scales are built, so that we can use that for our improvisation later. So these are really, really the building blocks of improvisation and composition, which we'll come to in a couple of chapters later. Usually if you're just learning a piece, all you're going to do is look at the very beginning right next to your clefs, your bass clef and your treble clef, and take a look, see if there's any sharps or any flats. If there's not, that means that it's set in C major, which has no sharps or no flats. But if it has some, you need to make sure to set your lyre in accordance with that key signature. Okay. Let's now move to page 51, because this shows us, well, it shows us a couple more examples. So actually, let's go through that. E major, we see there are 4 sharps. It's going to be F, C, G, and D. So all of those, which is what we talked about earlier on page 50, all those we need to make sharp. And then the next one is E flat major, where we have 3 flats, and we need to make all those strings flat. So this will be B, E, and A. They're always going to be the same. That is, the key signature is always going to be the same in your treble and your bass clef. They're never going to be different. Sometimes in music for non-diatonic instruments, you can change key signatures in the middle of the piece, but that's not possible for a lyre. These are some of the things to be aware of if you're trying to, and again, we'll have a lesson on this, if you're trying to take music from other instruments, especially a chromatic instrument, and translate it to be possible for your lyre. If it changes keys in the middle of the piece, you're not going to be able to do that on the lyre. So those are just some of the limitations of this particular instrument. So again, these are the building blocks to understand more advanced things a little bit later. Okay, now let's move down to continuing to look at page 51. And we're going to look at all key signatures, all flat and all sharp key signatures. And we can see on the left we have no sharps, and then below no flats. And then we go up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. The most you can have in any sharps or any flats is 7. All right. Go ahead and study that little diagram. And I think I'm going to come back. Let's go ahead and separate this. I'd like to include this section along with the circle of fifths, because it's a little bit better to understand both of these side by side. So again, pause, take a moment, however long you need to really digest, okay, what is a key signature? What does that mean for my lyre? How does that relate to the scale that has been formed? And any other questions that maybe you have, go ahead and read over this text and make sure it's really solidified before we move forward. And so we'll come back in just a moment for that next part. Okay, looking back again at page 51, I'm going to refrain from talking about the relationship between major and minor scales for a moment because it's a little bit easier to see on the circle of fifths. What I want to point out here, though, is what this little box underneath actually has articulated. When we move from left to right with both sharps and flats on this little diagram, you'll notice that let's take the sharps. As the sharps increase, you actually keep the sharps that you had previously and add one more. So for example, when I move from G major to D major, I see that I go from 1 sharp to 2 sharps. Okay. The question is, well, how do I know what is actually sharped in that for that particular key? Do I need to figure out the whole scale from D and use our intervals, whole step, half step, whole, half, to figure that out? Well, that's one way. That's one way. But a more, just an easier way to do it is to memorize the order of sharps. And so again, when we go from E major to D major, G major has one F. It's one sharp, it's F sharp. D major is going to keep that F sharp and add one more. That next one is C sharp. Then when we move to A major, which has now 3 sharps, we will keep F sharp and C sharp and add G sharp to that. Moving forward, the same thing. You'll always keep the sharps that were present before it. And they're always going to be in the same order. And this is really helpful because rather than, for example, when we get all the way up to, F sharp major, where there's 6 sharps, they're not 6 random sharps. They're actually all the sharps that you've already built up to in all the other major scales, plus one more, which is E sharp. And so you actually only need to memorize one additional sharp as you go up from left to right on these. The same is true in flats. So, and you can see this visually. You can see, oh wow, it's actually all the same. All right, I'm in F major. I see there's a little B flat. And then when I go to B flat major, I see, well, we kept that B flat. And we just added an E flat. Okay, we move now to E flat major. And I see, oh, we've kept the B flat, the E flat, and now we've added an A flat. And same thing moving forward. So the relationship between the different keys in regards to how many sharps or flats is all in a pattern. Music is very pattern oriented. And so this is helpful as we kind of zoom farther and farther away to see the bigger and bigger picture. We started with whole steps, half steps, moved to scales, then to keys and key signatures, and now we're looking at multiple key signatures, actually all the key signatures, and understanding, oh, there's even a pattern for that. And in a moment, we're going to see that pattern with even greater simplicity and clarity. Okay. So that's just to give you an overall view of all possible key signatures. And we also see the scales, or the keys, that are related to those. That's the C major, G major, D major, A major, etc. That's listed below. That's the second column, or the second row, on both the sharps and the flat key signatures. Okay. Underneath is a little, again, a little mnemonic trick or shortcut for us if you want to memorize these. That is the order of the sharps and of the flats. So, and there's multiple of these, you can look at these online, but the sharps is Father Charles goes down and ends battle. And so this aligns with the key signatures that we've got up here at the top. So we have F, then in the next one in D major we have F and C, Father Charles. Then in A major we have 3 sharps, Father Charles goes, etc. And you keep going down that little sentence as you move down to more and more sharps. The flats, it's actually using the same words, it's just backwards, which is kind of fun because it works. And it says battle ends and down goes Charles' father. I thought that was kind of fun that it worked forwards and backwards. So that's the order of the flats. Okay. Now, let's go ahead. You may need to pause here, but I'm going to keep going here. Now let's flip the page and look at the circle of fifths. What this basically does is puts all this information into one nice diagram. Sorry, that crudeness. Being weird. Into one really, really nice diagram. And it helps you to understand how these keys are even developed. Okay. And then I'm going to introduce the relationship between major and minor, and this is super helpful for improvisation and composition. So again, go ahead and take a look at the that paragraph up there before you listen to my video, because it will help it even be more clear. But essentially, what we want to recognize is that it's called the circle of fifths because when you start at the top at the 12 o'clock, right, where the 12 o'clock hand would be on a normal clock, C major, no sharps, no flats. If we go clockwise, this is actually 1/5 above. So you could say it's the 5th note of this scale. So if we're in C major, we have C, D, E, F, and then G is the 5th note of that scale. And so basically what this shows is that the interval between every single one of these keys and key signatures is a fifth when you're going clockwise. All right? And it is a fifth up. It's the fifth note up from the scale. And this follows the order of sharps and flats that we saw on page 51. So let me say this through an example so it'll help crystallize and clarify. I have C major. I've got no sharps and no flats. Okay. But then I want to go up 1/5 from C to G. Now I can't do this on a diatonic instrument, but then I would start G, and I know every time I go up a fifth, I just add one sharp. We're just looking at sharps right now. If I've memorized that little mnemonic before, I know that this is F sharp. So G major has one F, one sharp, which is F, and I can just start from G. We'll pretend this is an F sharp, and then G. Then starting from G, let me find a different G. Let's go, we'll start here with this G. And we go up a fifth, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That will take us to D, and we add one more sharp. We have to keep the F sharp that came before, and we add one more, which is C sharp. We go from D and count up 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This will take us to A, and we have A major. We have to add another sharp. We had 2 with D. We add one more. That gets us 3 sharps. We keep our previous sharps, F and C, and we add one more, which is going to be G sharp. And you continue this until you run out of sharps. So you go from A to E to B to F sharp to C sharp. This is the same order that is illustrated in a different way on page 51, going left to right. So we're going around in a circle. And what we're pointing out now is that every time you move up and you add a sharp, that's actually a fifth above. Okay? Now for flats, we work in the opposite direction. And you can do this in a couple of different ways. The easiest way to do this is to go down a fifth. So if we're at C major, again, we're at the top of that clock, and we go down a fifth, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, we have F, and we add one flat now. Rather than sharps, we're adding flats. F has one flat, which is B flat. Then we go from F. I can't do this here because now we're in, I don't have a B flat on here. But you'll go down 5 notes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now this would normally be a B flat if I was tuned to F major. And I then have to add a second flat. I keep B flat and I add E flat. If I went from E flat and had that scale and went backwards, went down that scale, I'd end up 5 notes, a fifth, which is an interval of 5. I'd end up on E flat. I'd add one more flat. This gives me B, E, and A. And I keep doing this until I get from E flat to A flat to D flat, G flat, and C flat. Okay. So that's how it's all organized, and they all go together. 2 additional things we need to point out. The first is a little small one, is we'll see at the bottom here, it kind of looks a little messy. And you realize, wait a second, some of these flats and some of these sharp key signatures are the same. This is because, for example, a D sharp and an E flat are the same note. And so if I were to play the B major scale, which has 5 sharps, and then I were to follow that and play the C flat major scale, which has 7 flats, I would be playing the exact same notes. And so you just need to know that that's the case. And generally, the composer will choose, of those 2, will choose the one that has less sharps or less flats. So they would pick B because it only has 5 sharps instead of 7 flats. Sometimes that's not the case for reasons I honestly don't know. But just so you know that that's the way that it is. This is the same but this is the same overlap that we have between G flat major and F sharp major. Now these actually have equal amount of sharps and flats. G flat has 6 flats, F sharp has 6 sharps. The third time this occurs is with D flat, which has 5 flats, and C sharp, which has 7 sharps. So they are aligned that way because you actually end up with the same notes. Okay, I'm going to pause here, actually, because I think that's a lot of content. We're going to finish the circle of fifths by talking about the relationship between major and minor scales and keys. So take a moment to digest this, and come back when you feel like you're ready to understand major and minor relationship. Okay, the last aspect of the circle of fifths is the relationship between major and natural minor keys or key signatures. You can see these little letters on the inside of the circle. Typically, major scales or major keys are indicated with uppercase letters. Minor ones are indicated with lowercase letters. And what you need to know, and what this is showing you in the circle of fifths, is that there are minor scales that share the same key signature as major scales. So for example, C major, which is what I'm tuned in, shares the same key signature, which is no sharps and no flats, as A minor, and we see that little A underneath. So here's my C major scale. Okay, I can also play A minor without changing any of my strings, and everything is the same in this scale. I just start on a different note. So here's A minor. You see how different that sounds? Very, very different sound. But you notice I can play in this C major, or I can play in the A minor. Oops, here it is. And I don't have to change anything on the lyre. I can also switch between these two, right? I could stay in C and then drop down to A minor and then come back to C and then go back to A, back to C, down to A, and in on C. Now we're going to talk way more about this with the improvisation and composition section, but I just want you to know that you can see this on the circle of fifths, and that this is true for any key that you set your lyre to. And so, for example, A major has 3 sharps. F minor, which we see on the inside of the little circle, also has 3 sharps. And to find that natural minor, you need to, I don't actually say this in the book, you need to go down, it's an interval of a third. Okay, and so it's always going to be, so here's my C, make sure you can see this. You're going to go down 3 strings. So we'll have 1, we'll count the C as 1, we go down to B, and then our 3rd string A. This is your natural minor. So basically there's 1 string between the start of your major scale or your major key and your minor key. This will always be the case. Say I had my lyre tuned to D major. To find the relative minor, the one that shares the same key signature, it has the same amount of sharps, the same amount of flats, I'd go down, I count my D as 1 string, then I go down to C, and then I'd go down my 3rd string, which is a B. And I realize, okay, B is where my minor, that doesn't sound minor because this needs to be C sharp. B will be my natural minor. Okay? You can do that with any key, again, any key or any key signature on the lyre, and it's really useful, it allows you to really open up a certain space on here. But we needed to know how we got there and what that really means in order to work with the music, especially if you want to do some composing or improvisation on your lyre. Okay, so natural minors share the same key signature as majors, and they're indicated on the inside of the circle of fifths. Okay, let's pause there. I'm gonna have one more little section here. We've already kind of named a lot of this, but there's some good visuals, and I dedicated basically a whole page to this. So we're going to talk about diatonic versus chromatic instruments, and this is really helpful if you just have no idea what that really means. So come back whenever you're ready, and we're just going to outline that. Okay, this will be a much briefer section because it's just not quite so complicated, and I've already said it actually several times. So with a chromatic instrument, the piano is the best example. You've got every key always available to you. Every pitch, I should say, pardon me, every pitch always available to you. In order to change into a different key, you just play different notes on there, but they're all available to you. With a diatonic instrument, you have to set your strings to certain keys according to the key signature. However many flats it tells you to set it to, you need to change your tuning to that. However many sharps, you need to change your tuning to that, etc. And you cannot play outside of that. You lose the note that you're, say I change my B to a B flat, I lose my capacity to then play a B for that whole song. With some instruments like a lever harp, there's little levers that change this, and so you could change that within the song. But with a diatonic instrument, you cannot do that. So it's really important for you to understand. Okay. This little image here shows you the difference between these, really. So it gives an example. We've got D sharp. It's not D sharp, D major, which has two sharps as its example. So if I'm playing in D on a piano, it simply means, as it shows here, that I would just avoid the F and the C. I would instead play F sharps and C sharps. It means that I sort of almost like deactivate certain keys. I just avoid them because they don't sound like they fit. They would sound quite wrong. In contrast, so that's how I would play in that specific key, D major or the relative minor, which is B minor. In contrast, again with the lyre, instead what I would need to do is change all my Fs and all my Cs to F sharp and C sharp. And that would then allow me to access D major or B minor. But I cannot then go back to, for example, C major, which has no sharps and no flats. I can only do that. I can only access the particular key or scale that I'm actually tuned into. Okay. That is really the essence of what you need to know for that. It is a limited amount of flexibility, but again, in later chapters, we're going to talk about, actually, there's a lot more that we can do, even though we can't change the key that we're in, and just helps us to understand the creativity that is also possible within the restrictions that a diatonic instrument has. Okay. Following this, you've got a lot of practice to help this really crystallize on page 53 and 54. The answers are on page 55. And you can do this in whatever order that you desire. They focus on different things. The first one focuses on relative minor in relation to major scales. The second one focuses on key signatures and identifying which key it is according to the number of sharps or flats that are there. And then the last one, exercise 3, indicates basically how to build your scale, whether it's major or minor, following that whole step, half-step movement. So if you kind of want to follow the trajectory of the lesson, you actually kind of want to do it backwards. You're going to do number 3 first, then number 2, and then number 1. And again, there's answers on page 55 so that you can make sure that you're doing it correctly. And again, helping this all to really crystallize for you. Okay, so let's end with a few comments at the very end, and then we'll call it a day. Okay, so hopefully that really helps you to understand how we get from intervals to scales, keys and key signatures, and then how they all relate together. If you are feeling overwhelmed at this point, there's probably 2 things I would recommend to do. Maybe 3. Let's do 3. 1, just take it slow. and do the practice. Maybe you want to start with the understanding of the scales and then immediately do the exercise 3 practice, where you are practicing that very particular skill. And then move on to the next part where you're looking at key signatures. Then practice exercise 2. That might be one way to do it. Take it slow. Don't do it all probably in one sitting unless this is review for you. So that's the first thing, take it slow. The second is put it into practice. So if you've got sheet music already, take a look and say, okay, I want to figure out what the key signature is, identify that in that particular piece. And then looking at the different notes, you're going to see that, for example, if it's in C major scale or C major, it's going to hover around the C a lot, unless it's in also A minor, and then it's going to hover around the A, what's called the tonic note, that first note of the scale. So try to implement and sort of put into context this information with what you're already trying to do. That will be really helpful, and also bring up any questions that you might have of how this information does actually lay on to your specific application. And then the third thing already is that there's lots of different resources that explain the same information in slightly different ways. And so take advantage of that. Or maybe you want to do more practice. There's lots of free practice out there. So that would be another option for you. Of course, if you have any questions, if there's anything that you just can't quite understand, feel free to reach out to me and I'll be able to help you as best as I can. You may also have a friend who can read sheet music, and they are going to be able to help you out with a lot of this stuff as well. And that one-on-one and in-person is always best. So take advantage of those opportunities as well. Okay, God bless you. May the peace of Christ be with you. I hope you're enjoying everything, and thank you so much. I really appreciate it.